Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Christopher Gennari. I am from the Department of History at Camden County College in Blackwood, New Jersey. And this is the lecture, Opportunities Denied: How Income Inequality Limits Access to Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness. So the first thing we have to talk about is income inequality. What is it and why does it matter? And income inequality is a requirement of capitalism, but it is antithetical to the democratic system. And America is built on these two antithetical ideas. That one of capitalism and one of democracy. And we talk about them as if they go together, but they are actually counterintuitive to each other. Capitalism requires some people to accumulate money in order to invest in economic or cultural progress. Our best example of this is Carnegie, who is worth at one point $310 billion, or the equivalent today of $310 billion, and wrote a book that's basically called The Gospel of Wealth. The idea is that you made lots of money so that you can then give it away and invest it in making your society better. And so we get colleges like Carnegie Mellon, we get lots of libraries, we get the Teachers Investment Fund, TIAA, CREF. We get the largesse of donors. And we see the biggest donors in periods of the largest income inequality, the 1880s, the 1920s, and the 2000s. Capitalism requires someone to work for the lowest wages. So, in order to invest in businesses and invest in culture, you need people with a lot of money to do that. That's what we just talked about. But you also need the opposite. You need someone to not make a lot of money. You need someone to work for the lowest wage. Why? Because wages are the variable in the making of a product versus the resources versus the machinery. Coal costs X. I can't negotiate that number in any large way. The machinery, the factory, costs Y. And I really can't negotiate that. If I want the machine, I have to pay what the company that makes a machine is charging. But wages, I can negotiate. And so capitalism requires someone to work for the lowest wages. And what we see is the idea that you'll work for nothing or as low as possible. And we see this through slavery, through Jim Crow segregation, through redlining. The idea of creating a permanent underclass that is either forced to work for nothing or for very limited wages. And that will prop up a fiscal elite. Democracy, on the other hand, is about equality. Everyone's vote counts the same. Everyone counts the same. Everyone is equal. The idea of one person, one vote. The idea of rich and poor, black and white. The idea that we are a common wheel. And several states are not states, they are commonwealths. The idea that all citizens of Massachusetts, of Virginia, I believe of Kentucky as well, have an interest in the success of that commonwealth. And democracy is about the connection between rich and poor. In ancient Rome and in ancient Athens, ancient Rome is not a democracy, it's a republic, but they had, like us, we're a republic, we're not a democracy like ancient Athens is, but the idea was you had citizen participation in the government, and so you have a paternalism between the rich and the poor. And make no mistake, there's also a fear. The rich people may run society, but there may be 2, 3, 4% of society. So there's also a fear because they know they are vastly outnumbered. And so there's a balance, and the idea is that we are all in this together. And in Rome, the rich people were represented in the Senate, the poor people were represented by their tribunes, and there's a balance. But democracy is about equality. So let's talk about the income part. So America is built on and always has had income inequality. Some eras are much wider than others. So let's talk about what it is now. What do we talk about when we mean poor? What do we talk about when we mean middle class? What do we talk about when we mean rich? And so poor and poverty. So when you say these people are poor, that's a relative statement. But we do have a number, and that number is about, for a family of 4, $25,000 a year. Yes, that's in the Northeast. There are some variation for cost of living, but these numbers don't change that much. So for a family of 4 living on less than $25,000, that is poor. That's poverty. That's the bottom 20% of Americans. That's 1 in 5. 1 in 5 Americans live in, have lived in, will continue to live in some form of poverty. That's children. That's old people. In fact, that's a major reason why Social Security exists, is because by 1930, 25% of all seniors lived in poverty with no savings. The middle class is this amorphous idea. What is the middle class? And there are entire college courses about that. And so what I take is that middle group from the 25th percentile to the 75th percentile. And that's roughly from $35,000 a year to $90,000 a year. That's your blue-collar working class factory worker at $35,000. Up to your master's degree educated service professional, teacher, college professor, nurse, cops, firemen, so that's 35,000, and that's the middle. That's that middle group. That's the 25th percent to the 75th percentile. The average for an American in the United States right now, an American family, is $56,000. American household is $56,000. So who are the rich? Well, at the top 10%, you start at $140,000. The top 5% start at $188,000. And the top 1% starts at $383,000. And remember, this is income per year. And this is how you get income inequality. Because now multiply that by 40 years. Someone who works from, say, 25 to 65. You take this difference, and suddenly you have an accumulation of wealth and difference. So, income inequality is bad in history. It leads to bad things. And there's massive income inequality through most of history. You have a rich 2% and everyone else is poor, 98%. There is no middle class. There is no middle group. And so we have big events in history that are caused by this conflict, by the stress of rich and poor. We have the fall of the Roman Republic, the Roman Civil Wars, the rise of an emperor who promises, I can fix these problems. Now, the fall of the Roman Republic is a complicated thing, but one of the major things is people lost faith in their government. They didn't think the Senate, they didn't think the Republic could fix their problems. And so they looked towards individuals, rich individuals, who would hire them. And these rich individuals, Caesar, a Pompey, created their own armies. And then they waged private wars for private gain. And then they turned those armies that were loyal to the individual on each other. The Protestant Reformation in the 1500s attacked the Catholic Church and specifically attacked the wealth, the institutional wealth of the Catholic Church. The French Revolution and the guillotine in 1788, it was good to be a rich guy in France. By 1792, you had a 1/4-inch space where your neck used to connect to your shoulders. That's not good. The French Revolution is completely a revolution overturning the social groups. Rich people who survived actually gave up their wealth, gave up their titles. In grand fashion, declared, I am a citizen, I am no longer a lord. The civil wars in Europe in 1848, the liberal civil wars, the liberal revolutions of 1848. If you ever watched Les Mis or read Victor Hugo's Les Mis, that's the 1830s in France, but it's the same cultural idea. The rich versus the poor. If you watch Les Mis, the second act is all about the rich versus the poor. The American Civil War has an aspect of income inequality to it. Now, the American Civil War is caused by slavery, by the fact that slavery existed south of the Mason-Dixon line. But that slavery allowed for the creation of a rich planter class. And that rich planter class had 3 times the wealth of the wealthiest people in the North, on average. The top 1% in the South, who made their wealth from owning human property, human labor, were worth more than the northern industrialists who had to pay for their labor. There's even a line in the Broadway play Hamilton about this. Slavery accounted for 3/5 of the wealth of the southern top 10%. So if you were the richest Southerners, slavery created 3/5. Slaves literally were 3/5 of your wealth. And so I have the site you can go to read about this. But what it created was a plantation class that the northern armies attacked. There is plenty of letters from Sherman and from Grant about going after the planter class. They blamed the planter class for the Civil War and the institution of slavery with it. The Russian Revolution, the stock market collapse of 1929, the Spanish Civil War of the 1930s. These all have components of income inequality to it, of the poor attacking the institutional wealth of the rich. Income inequality, when it gets to too high of a level, causes problems in society. So, let's talk about life, because this is a piece about life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, right there in the Declaration of Independence. So let's talk about life. Okay, income. The difference between the top 1% and the lowest quintile is 61 times. So the average 1%er makes 61 times, right now in the last numbers we have is 2013, 61 times what the person in poverty makes. So that's a huge, massive gap. There is no way of bridging that gap. Absolutely, there's no way you can work. So when anyone says, oh, just work harder, there is no way you can bridge the 61 times bridge. It just isn't. But here's what's even more interesting. I mean, we know there's a massive difference between the top 1% and the lowest. But even within the top 10%, top 20%, there's a huge difference between the 96th and the 99th percentile. So this is the top 5%. The difference is 5 times. And the difference from the 80th, the top 20%, to the 99th percent, top 2%, is 15 times. This is why upper middle class professionals vote for tax cuts, why they feel poor, why right now in American politics, they look at why, because they live in those neighborhoods or they live near those neighborhoods. And they say, why can't I have what they have? They look like me, they act like me, I'm educated like they are, and yet they earn 15 times more than me. You can't, again, bridge that gap. There's no way you can work harder and make 15 times more. So, to life. In 1929, if you were born in 1929, you could expect to live 57 years. Okay. That was an increase, actually. Around 1900, you could expect to live 40 to 45 years. So that was doing well. In 2010, you can live to be 79 years of age. That's an increase of 22 years in a little less than a century. That's nice. That's a quarter of your life. That's awesome. Also, there has been a continuous 4-year gap between race and gender. White men live 4 years longer than black men. White women live 4 years longer than black women. And this is fairly continuous throughout the century. But if we go into those numbers, that average, that nice little average of going up and up and up and up, changes. Dramatically changes. Because wealth equals life. The numbers are clear. There is a correlation between how wealthy you are and how much life you have. In those 30 years, from 1980 to 2010, in those 30 years, the top quintile, the top 20%, 25%, top 20%, has gained 12 years of life over the lowest quintile. So remember we talked about the top 80%? Go back to this. So here, top right there, 75. So we're talking like 65,000 plus versus the less than 25,000. That will get you as much as 12 years if you are. That will get you as much as 12 years of life. In fact, you get 6 years of life if you are the top 1% versus the 80th percentile, the upper middle. Meanwhile, since 1980, the poorest Americans, the people who make less than those $25,000, actually have lost 5 years of life. Now think about how crazy that is. Think about how good our hospitals are, how good our nurses are, how awesome our knowledge is, how much better everything has gotten in the healthcare industry. Our drugs, our pharmaceuticals, our knowledge. And yet the poorest Americans lived longer, 5 years longer in 1980 than they do today. They have gone backwards. This is also tied to education. Wealth is going to equal education, and education is going to equal wealth. And so a white male with a PhD can expect to live 14 years longer than a black male with no high school diploma. 14 years. That's what? 20% longer on average? That's massive. And that helps increase income inequality. So, let's look at this. Okay. So now I got my mouse. We're going to take a look. You, as nurses and doctors and medical professionals, have to deal with this problem. And the problem is that poorer people are sicker than richer people. And in fact, there's a continuum. The richer you are, the healthier you will be. But also, the poorer you are, the sicker you will be. So here, less than 35,000 versus make more than 100,000. Now remember, the 100,000 is not the top 1%. We're still talking like, what was it? The 20th percentile or so. 15th percentile. And yet, look at here's coronary heart disease. Look at coronary heart disease. We have an incidence of 8.1. I want to say that's per 1,000 or 100,000, but it's 8.1. Whatever the number is, we care more about the ratios. It's half that for a person making over $100,000. Stroke, half. Emphysema is 1/4. It's like 400% less. Diabetes, more than half. Vision trouble, more than half. No teeth is 1/3. Tells you about the access to both dentistry and healthier foods. Liver disease is 3 times less in someone who makes $100,000 more than someone who makes less than $35,000. You are dealing with this. So how someone lives creates the different health outcomes, and the poverty will kill you. And they show up at your door. They come to you for help. And how much money they make affects their health concerns and their health outcomes. So, take a look at this. In 2011, almost 1/4 of adults with family incomes under $35,000 had no usual place for medical care, compared with 6% of 100,000. Similarly, 22% did not have a dentist within the last 5 years, compared with 4.3%. Well, there's your 1/3 of families with over $100,000. Poor people will be sicker than richer people will be. This is also true in psychological issues. Feelings of worthlessness, hopelessness, sadness. Psychological outcomes will are also orders of magnitude different. Look, sadness in people that make less than 35,000 is 6.4%. By just getting over the 35,000, getting around 40,000, it goes down by half. You get to 50,000, it goes down almost a half again. At 75,000, the 75,000 to 100,000, there are companies, a couple of them I think out in Seattle, that have seen this number, and what they do is they say, "Oh, we're going to pay all of our employees 75,000." Because the idea is you need to make at least $75,000 to be happy. And there's not a increase in happiness from over 75,000. That doesn't mean you shouldn't make more than 75,000. It's just that paying someone $200,000 doesn't make them particularly happier or less sad, less hopeless than at 75,000. And a lot of this has to do with security, with basic emotional stability. The idea that if you lose your job, you won't lose your house. You could find another job. The idea that you have options. You can start a business. That you have a future, even if bad things happen. You have insurance. You have a safety net. So psychological outcomes are orders of magnitude. So not only are you getting sicker people, and we live in Philadelphia, in the Philadelphia suburbs, where we see a great difference between, say, Conshohocken and the south side of Philly. And so we see a huge difference. The people who are coming to your hospital are going to fit on this spectrum, and they're going to have these issues. And the people who are going to come that are worse are going to be the poorer people. And they're also going to have more psychological traumas as well. So the consequences. Personal health outcomes are in large measure not a person's fault. One cannot choose to be rich. Economics drives both your environment and your outcomes. And we have seen a 30-year-long trend of decline. If you live in Camden, it is hard to get fresh fruit. It just is. There are no large supermarkets. And so just getting fresh vegetables, fresh fruit, a salad is hard to get. And that's economic. That's not a personal. You didn't choose to not eat a salad. There isn't a salad to eat. Healthcare needs of people are different for different socioeconomic groups, and it's unethical to treat them similarly. The idea of what you may see on Twitter or on Facebook when people get together and they talk about these things why can't you just eat better? Why can't you just get more exercise? Well, the people who live in Haddonfield, Voorhees, can go for a walk, go for a run, have a park, play a sport. That is not necessarily possible in downtown Camden, for example. So it's why don't you just get 30 minutes of exercise 3 times a week? The question then becomes, where? How? For certain groups. They don't have the economy to change their environment. And so they simply live in a different world of possibilities. It's a much smaller world of possibilities. 3, poor people will need more expensive intervention in the healthcare system, and more often and earlier, because people can't afford it. They don't have the insurance. Many, if you're earning less than $25,000, don't work in an industry that provides insurance. The benefits of working. This is the group we call the working poor. They may work 40 hours a week, but they work in low-wage hourly labor that doesn't come with health benefits. This will make people wait until they cannot ignore the problem, which means something that was easy, hypertension, something that could have been handled a year ago, 2 years ago, some mental health issues, stress, heart palpitations, high blood pressure, obesity. People will wait until they cannot ignore it. The result of this will be worse healthcare outcomes and more expensive intervention, and the less of the ability to pay for it. And that will put stress on the healthcare system, both physically, because these people will need more expensive intervention and more times to enter the healthcare system. So you need to have more hospital space. You need to have more nurses, more doctors, more machines, more beds, more space physically in the healthcare system, but also financially, as these people will have less ability to pay for their worse healthcare issues. You also get earlier death, as we talked about earlier. So the earlier death means that you get the financial destruction of dependents. The adult male who dies at 60 doesn't collect Social Security and yet paid into it their entire life. And so that money from Social Security will go somewhere else. But it also means that you lose, if they die at 60, but they could have lived to 85 as an average, they are losing 25 years of income that they can't pass on. There's no inheritance. There's less inheritance. Maybe there's less insurance. Life insurance. There's less ability to build wealth. So that dependents, spouses, children, have less to build off of because they simply had less time. Their parents simply had less time to build something. Money simply takes time to build. Always has. So that brings us to liberty. Well, what does this have to do with freedom? Okay. Here is the Cato Human Freedom Index. Cato is a think tank, conservative think tank, and they do a yearly index of human freedom. They create a ranking system of every country in the world. Now, by being a conservative group, an American conservative group, they are going to weigh things, certain conservative ideas heavier than certain liberal ideas. So higher taxes counts as less freedom than lower taxes does. Things like that. But it's a fairly good listing of a ranking of peoples. The second is the OECD tax rankings. Now, the OECD is basically when we talk about industrialized countries, modern industrialized countries. It's mostly Europe, North America, South America, and parts of East Asia. And so it's when you think of a modern country, you're thinking of the OECD. And what we get is a correlation, not a causation, but a correlation between personal freedom and a redistributive tax system. Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Austria, Finland. Notice the top 5 are all in the top 10 of taxation. The top 5 in freedom are all in the top 10 of taxation. Switzerland is dramatically better. They have lower taxes, but more freedom. They are a more decentralized system than most other countries. They have much more local autonomy. But Iceland, Netherlands, Luxembourg, again. So we're talking the 8th, 9th countries, and we're talking the 10th, 11th, 12th taxed countries. The Anglo world does moderately better. Australia, United Kingdom, Canada. France, Italy, Belgium do significantly worse. So France is the second highest tax country, but the 30th in freedom. Now, they have a presidential system like we do, not a parliamentary system like the British or Anglo countries do, and so that plays into it. Italy and Belgium have had parliamentary troubles over the last 10 years, 20 years. And so, but we see the top 10 in taxes, and their teens or 20s in the freedom. Only Hungary is in the top 10 and not on the freedom list. In top 10 of taxation, but not on the freedom list. And they now have a fascist party running their government. The United States is where you would expect it to be. It is the, It is the 30th ranked tax country, and that includes corporate taxes. That's all taxation, includes corporate taxes. Taxation revenue as percentage of GDP. And it is the 30th most free country. 31st most free country. So it's right where it would be. Where one would expect it to be. Which means we have a less redistributive tax system, and we have less freedom. And this is from a conservative think tank, by the way. Remember, this isn't some lefty, socialist, communist, university professors saying, haha, I'm going to prove America needs communism. No. This is the Cato Institute. And so the United States comes in 30th in taxes and 31st in freedom. Let's take a look at this. This is the Human Development Index. The UN creates this, and it tries to go into how well your life is, depending on where you're born, what country you live in. It takes all those things in. It takes income, it takes healthcare, it takes life, it takes all of the things that go into a good life that you can measure, and plops it in and comes out with a formula. And you have Norway, Australia, Switzerland, Denmark, Germany, Singapore, the Netherlands, Ireland. Notice how they ranked up here, right? Denmark, Sweden, Norway. So the United States comes in tied for 10th with Canada. Nice. That sounds good. That's way better than 30th. That's nice. That's good. We come even above Sweden and New Zealand. Countries that here, Sweden is number 2 in freedom, and New Zealand is 23rd. And yet in the Human Development Index, we are better than them. Woo! USA. We rock. Except that is the number that we're looking at. This number is for everyone. It's a huge average. When you take income inequality into account, it changes. When you take income inequality, these two numbers, you notice two things. One, the Human Development Index for the United States drops by 10 countries, 10 spots. Sweden goes up by 3. The United States goes down by 10. We go from 10th to 20th. And when you look at what our income inequality is, the ratio is 9.1. Whereas for every other country above us, it is 4 to 5, with 6 being the highest. We are double the income inequality of every other rich country. That we can compare ourselves to. The only country that takes more of a hit is South Korea. They lose 19 spots. Sweden, Iceland, Netherlands, Norway all gain when inequality is taken into account. The Finland goes up 9 spots. The Czech Republic goes up 10 spots. We drop 10 spots. And our income inequality is twice what it is in every other country. So what does it tell you? This tells you if you're rich, you get a really nice life in America. But when you separate the rich from the poor, suddenly America isn't the best place to live in. It hurts your freedom. It literally gives you less freedom because you can literally do less than countries with more distributive tax systems. We see this in prisons. Less than 10% of whites live in poverty, so they have a population of X. We have the full numbers here, but I want to put this into some kind of perspective. 22% of African Americans live in poverty. They have 5 times the amount, the ratio of whites in prison. They have twice the poverty rate, but 5 times the prison population. Hispanics have twice the poverty rate and twice the prison population. Poorer people are less free, not only metaphysically, as I mentioned before, with being unable to buy more freedom, more things, more travel, more opportunities. They are literally in jail more. You are literally less free. So income inequality creates less freedom from hunger, freedom from want, freedom from stress, freedom from abuse, and less freedom too. Freedom to move, freedom to change, freedom to travel, freedom to work. The higher your income inequality, the less social mobility you have, the less ability you have to change classes. So you say, just get a job. Well, what job? You're not going to go from working in McDonald's to working on Wall Street, from making $8 an hour to making $80,000 a year. You'll have less education, less healthy living, less places to live. Like, there are simply less places you can buy if you have less money. Less outdoors, less job opportunities, less travel, less movement, less wealth, less value. Your life is worth less because you won't have the ability to make savings, to buy investments. There's less sport, less cultural activities, and less facilities like libraries to do cultural activities. There's more, simultaneously, while there's less of all those things, there's also more instability, more empty and unhealthy calories, more obesity, more divorce, more drug use, violence, abortion, and physical abuse. So while there is simultaneously less good things, there are more bad things in your life. Women, children, and minorities, marginal populations like the LGBTQ, the physically disabled, the mentally distressed, simply have less ability and power to change their outcomes. And with high income inequality, there's simply less ability to change. Their environment will shape them, as we've discussed. What about the pursuit of happiness? Well, we've already talked about ideas of worthlessness and sadness and mental health. But here, I want to take a 5-mile stretch of Haddon Avenue that goes across 3 zip codes in a row. That goes from Central Camden, 08104, to Collingswood, to Haddonfield. This is one road. It's a straight road. It goes right through these 3 neighborhoods, these 3 zip codes. Education equals income, and that income equals the neighborhood you live in, and the neighborhood you live in creates your wealth value. Most people's primary investment is their house. The thing that is worth the most in their life is the value of their house. Also, the better the neighborhood, the higher the income and the jobs, the more availability of jobs, and the better your children's education, all of which allows for future opportunities. You can borrow against the value of your house. Your kids will go to better schools. You'll make more money at your better job in the better neighborhood. What this means for poor neighborhoods is a brain drain and a wealth drain, or to be stuck in generational poverty. My students from Camden talk about getting out. They talk about staying. They don't talk about building. They don't talk about, with nostalgia, I'm going to buy a house across the street from my parents and have my kids grow up with their grandkids. No, they're talking about moving to Collingswood, moving to Haddonfield. Why? Let's take a look at these numbers right here. Now, I know they're a little hard to see, but the two big ones are this. In zip code 08104, the average median income is $25,000. Now remember, $25,000 in a household is poverty, is poor. So the average person in this zip code is poor. And their college graduation rate is 6%. 6% of people in this zip code have a college degree. 2 miles away, down Haddon Avenue, down one road, across Route 130 is Collingswood, which has 3 times the income. $75,000 per household. Has 3 times the income, but has 5 times, 6 times. I'm sorry, 7 times. I'm a historian, not a mathematician, but that was silly. 7 times. It has 3 times income, but 7 times the college graduation rate. Camden, New Jersey, 08104, is in the bottom 2% of zip codes. It's not the worst of all worst zip codes in the country. It's that next level. It's the bottom 2%. While Collingswood is in the top 20% of all zip codes in the country in terms of wealth and education. The lives between these two people who live in these two neighborhoods is vastly different. And then there's Haddonfield. Haddonfield, 2 miles down the road from Collingswood, where they make $100,000. They make, on average, the equivalent of Collingswood and Camden combined. And their college graduation rate is 63%, 20% more than half. Nearly 2/3 of people who live in Haddonfield have a college degree. And Haddonfield, top 5% of zip codes in the country. Now, this comes from the Washington Post. It's called Washington Post, A World Apart, where you can type in your zip code, any zip code you want, and it will bring up a map. And it goes from dark blue, which is bad, to bright yellow, which is good. And it will tell you what the income is, what the college graduation rate is, and where that zip code ranks. Oh, sorry. Where that zip code ranks, there it is, zip code ranks in the country. In terms of college education and income. And so this can't become this. no matter what you do. You fundamentally have to change both of these. But the jobs that would pay $75,000 go to people who have college education. And this area doesn't have it. So, this is 5 miles on a straight road in 3 zip codes. And the outcomes for children are vastly different. The outcomes for health are vastly different. The outcomes, the life experience of the people living in those 3 neighborhoods are vastly different. So, and how do we see that? We see that in crime. Camden has 3 times the violence and 2 times the property crime of a typical average American city. But remember that 2 miles? 2 miles down the road in Collingswood, they have 1/3 the violence and property theft of Camden. It is literally 66% safer 2 miles away. And 2 miles past that, Haddonfield has half Collingswood's violence and 1/5 Camden's. An area, many of you, if you go for a run or a bike ride, you travel. You easily will hit 5 miles on a bike. That's no problem. If you go out for a morning run, you might do 5 miles. And in that space that you ran is vastly different amount of violence and theft, of criminal outcome. All of which impacts the psychology, the life. I mean, the 3 times violence you're dealing with as nurses. Because those people are going to come in with knife wounds, gunshot wounds, drugs, beatings, abuse, assaults. They are literally coming in your door. And you have to deal with them. And yet the difference is a world apart. And yet in 2 miles. So the consequences. Income inequality equals a brain, talent, wealth drain. You get what we call the ghetto in history, which is an isolated island of people who are relatively homogeneous, relatively the same, and they're isolated economically and or culturally from the people around them, from the outside world. What this also does is create a brain drain of nurse, doctors, and health professionals as they go to better neighborhoods. Where would you rather work? In a hospital in downtown Camden? Or in Haddonfield, Voorhees, where you're going to have 1/5 the violence and trauma. And so urban facilities lose their best nurses, their best doctors, their best healthcare providers, which puts strain on all the others. And because the people who they deal with are least able to pay the cost of the healthcare, it means that those nurses, doctors, and healthcare providers are equally under increased financial stress. Because the hospitals and the health facilities they work for don't have the overhead to be able to afford to pay them, to keep them from going to Haddonfield, to Voorhees, to Conshohocken, to King of Prussia. This creates increasing psychological trauma on people, which is translated to healthcare professionals. I am not a nurse. I am not a doctor, and yet I know dealing with a gunshot victim is not a psychologically healthy event. So the more you deal with women, children who have these terrible outcomes, diseases that haven't been dealt with, illnesses that went on far too long, but since no one could pay for the doctor, they didn't go to one, and it got worse. So you get more pneumonia, tuberculosis, maybe more childhood diseases like mumps and measles that should have vaccinations, but maybe don't. That places trauma not only on the people who are suffering, but on the healthcare professionals who are dealing with it. There is also higher stress on social institutions and people working in those institutions. These institutions are counter-cyclical. People need them more when there's less money. Like during the last recession in 2008. In 2008, suddenly tax revenue dried up as people lost their jobs and housing lost its value. And at the same time, people needed those social institutions more because they were less able to pay for them themselves. What this equals is more work for less people with less resources to help, which means a burning out of people who are working and a burning out of institutions as talent leaves. So what are our historical solutions? Well, fortunately, we know stuff that works, and we've already kind of talked about it. The New Deal and the welfare state. Redistribution of taxes to aid social institutions to protect from poverty. That means money towards healthcare, social services, income services. More education, especially now college education, but also vocational training. And higher income for workers. Higher income for workers equals more consumers equals an economic growth. The United States, 80% of our economy is consumption, is people buying stuff. If people don't have money, they can't buy stuff. The idea of trickle down, of the rich people having the money and they'll make jobs for other people, well, how? Oh, they're going to start a business. Great. Who are they going to sell their products to? Other rich people? You run out of those people pretty quick. But if you have a broad middle class, a broad group that can afford your product, you will make more money. Henry Ford proved this when he started paying his workers $5 a day, which was an astronomical amount. People thought he was insane. Why would you do this? Carnegie had built his business on the backs of his workers. Why would suddenly Ford pay $5 a day? Well, he bought two things. One, he bought loyalty from his workers. They went on strike less. They fought with him less. And the second thing is, they spent more. And one thing they bought was Ford cars. And we see this. From 1948 to 1965, the baby boomers lived in a world where the economy grew at 4% per year. So no wonder baby boomers remember the 50s, or at least white baby boomers remember the 50s, and they go, wow, what a great time. Life was so great. Well, yeah, the economy was growing at 4%. Millennials from 1980 to 2000, they've lived in an age of 3.33% economic growth. Good for a large economy. But Generation Z, or the kids who were born in 2000, the kids who are just entering college now, they have lived in a world of less than 2% growth. So you yell at millennials, or you go, oh, just get a job. And they're right to shrug and go, what job? Where? At 2% growth, that's barely keeping up with population growth. Meanwhile, those income gains, which used to be, look, from 1950 to 1980, basically shared by everyone, right? The rich stayed rich and the poor were still poor. But when this happened, this 4% was pretty evenly divided between people. And in 1980, we have our first of our major tax cuts, the Reagan tax cuts. And you could see from this point on how the income gains of this smaller pie, remember, now we're making 3% from 1980 to 2000. But look, much more of it is going to the 95th, the top 5%. By 2017, we're talking only 2% growth, and much more of it is going to the top 5%. Meanwhile, here's 1980, and the median, meaning the 50%, those people earning about $56,000, and the 20th percentile, those people earning around $30,000, have essentially stayed flat. The bottom half of the country has not made any more money since 1980. They don't see any of the gains that the American economy has created. They didn't get this. From 1980 on, they didn't get anything in the 3%, and they're not getting anything in the 2%. They're getting pennies on the dollar. So we already did it. I mean, this is the amazing thing. We say, what can we do about income inequality? Well, we already did it. We did it from 1932 to 1980. Especially from 1932 to 1965. Now, what people will say is, well, the welfare state is just taking my money and giving it to somebody else. No, it's not. It's literally not doing that at all. What it is an investment in neighborhoods, investment in people, investment in economic growth in poor neighborhoods, investment in social institutions in poor neighborhoods. With the higher tax rates, and here are our tax rates, look at what the rich paid. Up more than 80% till 1960, 1962. And then it started to go down, and it's not till there's a big drop in 1980, and then a big drop again in Reagan-Bush. Reagan's second term, Bush's first term. So the top rate has continuously gone down. But remember what we bought from 1950 to 1970 or to 1980. We bought interstate highways. We bought a public education system. Go to any public college and look at the buildings that were built between 1955 and 1965. Most of our community colleges were built in this time period. Most of the public colleges are built in this time period. And certainly, even if they existed beforehand, you have massive growth from 1950 to 1965. So you buy education. You're investing in people. You're investing in neighborhoods. You get more stability, less divorce, less crime, less regression into poverty for women and children. Home values increase and you get better towns. As you get better towns, because you have less of all this stuff, you get better communal services that take more pressure off of people who need help. You have more wealth accumulation. And you have generational improvement, which means you get longer and better life for more people. And you get less taxes overall because income growth has happened and more people are earning more money. This is how Denmark works. This is how Sweden works. This is how France works. France is more productive than Americans are. A life of a French citizen is as good as an American, but they work 35 hours a week, while Americans have work well over 40. You'd actually have a better civilization. Japan does. Singapore does. Western Europe does. Scandinavia is famous for it. And you would work less and you would make more. Neighborhoods would be better. There would be less crime, which means your taxes could go down since you're not having to pay $50,000 a year for all those people in jail per person, per year in jail. More education, more vocational training means better jobs, better life outcomes. Most importantly for this discussion, better health. Because we go back all the way through all of our things, and we go back to this, where anything that helps anybody make more money will help them live a better, healthier, and longer life. And that is something that Europeans have figured out, Canadians have figured out, East Asia, Japan, Korea, Singapore have figured out. We have models we can pick. We have success stories we can use. We have our own success story. We have our own model of an American capitalist system that through high redistributive taxes built a large middle class, an educated middle class, substantial jobs, stability of neighborhoods, stability of home life. All the things that conservatives want. My conservative friends say, well, we should be married longer. There should be less divorce. There should be less abortion. There should be less of all of these things. We can do that. We have the model. We have an American model. We have a European model. We don't have to be Marxist communists. We could be, but we don't have to be. We have a model. We just refuse to use it. And that makes your lives harder. You are the people, if you're in the nursing industry, if you're a nurse, if you're a doctor, if you're in healthcare, you are dealing with this every day. Income inequality makes your job harder, makes your life harder, makes your industry harder than it has to be. Every hospital in America, every professional institution, nursing and doctors, drug company, all of them should be for less income inequality because it will help all of them. Because the outcomes, the prevalence of diseases will be better. And we can move from a system where you're constantly fighting, how do I take care of this? To how do I prevent it from happening in the first place? To more preventative medicine. Prenatal care. Things that help keep people alive longer and happier, with a better fulfillment of life longer. And that's something I think we all can be for. People living better, longer, happier lives. That's what we want, all of us, in all the service industries. The people being able to reach their fullest potential. So thank you for taking the time. I'm sorry that this is so long. I tried to give both historical part and some solutions and consequences and try to go into all of it. I used my magic cursor to kind of highlight things. I wish you all the best. Thank you very much for your time. Take care.